forward. We're in chapter 7. All right. So we've been talking a little bit about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So we're going to continue in that vein. A couple of the videos we watched, I believe on Monday, we watched about the salivating dog and how Pavlov was able to present some food and understand how these adrenal glands would produce salivation so that there was an expectation of food to come, and he moved from the food in the bucket to a bell. And when the dog heard the bell, he automatically began to salivate, which opened the door to much of our classical conditionings that we have now with training people or training animals. And one of the reasons why we have animals involved in many types of things today. All right, so let's look at your slides. I believe we're going to be on page 2 of your slides. We gave out several definitions on last time. We looked at the Bobo doll and aggression and how the teacher or the parent came out and was striking the doll and throwing the doll and being violent to the doll, and how the kid, without any instructions, just walks into a room and began to imitate behaviors that they saw previously. So that's another part of that classical conditioning. All right, so we are going to continue with the teaching on classical conditioning. All right. Okay, so classical conditioning principles, they provide insight to us. So when Pavlov started his work prompted Watson and some other, B.F. Skinner, some other behavioralists to do some research on conditioning responses. And so we're going to look at a few of those things today. So classical conditioning principles, they provide insight into today's world, would be like drug abuse, and how it can be overcome, anxiety, a lot of the mental health disorders, where you can recognize behaviors and track behaviors back to some classical conditioning, and how they can be managed. Classical conditioning works on the body's disease-fighting immune system. For example, when a particular taste accompanies a drug that influences the immune systems or immune responses, the taste by itself may produce those immune responses. For example, if I have anxiety and I've been conditioned to take a Xanax anytime anxiety is bad for me, and I take the Xanax and I wait a little bit and the Xanax kicks in and I feel my body calming down, your body will become conditioned throughout time and throughout following this process that it won't take the 10, 15, 20 minutes for the Xanax to kick in. Soon as the tongue hits the taste of the pill coming down that says I've taken this in a response for anxiety, you actually become calmer, because there is an expectation for this process to work. Why does it work? Because I've conditioned my mind to believe that when I do this particular thing, I will become a little bit more calm. And so I begin to calm down. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Watson's Little Albert. Now, we're not going to watch Little Albert today, but he did a Little Albert study demonstrating how classical conditioning may underlie specific fears. And so today's psychologists use extinction procedures or even new conditioning to change unwanted responses to emotional arousing stimulation. One of the videos we'll watch today and it's an older, probably early 70s because of the afros and stuff going on, you know. But they were trying to work with this group of people who dealt with anxiety or phobias. One guy's phobia was a phobia of elevators. And so they did some type of exposure therapy where he actually went into an elevator. They armed him with skills, things to do when you feel triggered. So they gave him all of these skills, all of these resources, and then they put him in the midst of this anxietous moment, and he had to pull out these skills, talk to myself, here's something I can taste, here's something I can hear. And so we'll watch how that response happened. And today, now this is back in the 70s when they were doing that, but we're still doing some conditioned responses just like that. Where you're afraid of snakes, well, we're going to take you to a room. So you're just going to, you don't have to touch any of them right now. Just stand in the same space with them and see if you can regulate emotion. And if you can regulate emotion, the next step would be we're going to walk closer to the cage, right? This may be weeks in the process of conditioning. Last step would be we're actually going to hold a snake. Now, that wouldn't be me, but we're actually going to hold a snake and see if your body can condition a different response from that of anxiety. All right, so let's look at a few before we move on to operant conditioning. There's a couple of videos that I want to show you, and one of these videos deal with, do violent games teach people to be violent? And there's probably a lot of controversy out there about violent video games or violent phone apps and stuff like that. Now, what are your thoughts before we watch this video? What do you think? Do violent games cause us to become violent or to act out on violent tendencies? Yeah.
I feel like it kind of depends on your age group.
Depends on the age group, yeah. And so remember we talked about that frontal lobe where there's logic and reasoning and making sense?
Yes.
And so any information that you're taking in the adolescent phase, all the way to 22, 23 is when the brain really is that executive function, it really kicks in and you're able to deduce and make some solid choices and decisions. Anything that happens in that influential stage is influenced. The triggers, brain waves, neural responses. You grow pathways in the brain differently by what you experience. You remember talking about that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, come.
I think there's no way to escape the reality that putting that into your mind, seeing it with your eyes, is going to affect you. But like Kyle said, it depends on the age group, and I think there's no way someone with a, I don't want to say fully developed because maybe our brains aren't actually fully developed, but someone with enough maturity will realize that nothing can make them act a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why.
Sure.
I think for somebody that's lived as long as I have and has raised children, I think it depends on the personality of the person, and also the thing I am concerned about is that it does kind of change the norm, and as people are exposed to so much violence, then they aren't going to react as they should. For instance, if they see something terrible happening in real life, they may be more passive because they're used to doing that.
Yes.
And I remember when I was growing up, you hardly ever heard about something horrible happening.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't even put it in the news.
Sure.
And now it's all over the place, so just people get a little bit desensitized.
Sure, absolutely. Just becomes a part of that classical conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. So you said something, I see your hand, George. You said something about it changes or it alters what's normal. Yeah. And so we came out of a culture where we deemed certain things as normal. And as culture changes and society changes, our norms, what was not acceptable now becomes acceptable. And we see the ramifications of that in our communities, right? There was, and this is just a brief segue, and I'm not trying to go down the bunny holes, but just to, and there was a day when marijuana was not legal. You couldn't buy it on the corner, right? And so as this become legalized, we see different ramifications of it in our communities. You see a rise of crime happening. You see families readily falling apart. You see a whole bunch of drug abuse things happening. You see people going toward opiates. And now the doctors become the drug pusher, right? Because the norm has changed. Our culture has changed, George.
No, I'm just going to say I completely agree with everything she said, because that's what they're moving towards into the military. So they're using video games in order for us to react to combatants and non-combatants. People see in the movies where it's a person that pops up and then there's a person with a gun. Well, they do that in video games now. And for us
Simulation.
Simulation, so we can react in split second. But for me, it doesn't cause me to be violent, but other people who really like shooting guns and all that stuff, it gives them a drive and a hyperness about it.
Sure. And so we talked a little bit about culture and history, and how our history and our culture may influence our decisions depending on the experiences that we have. And so what if you are an individual that grew up in a violent house, that grew up with in a violent community, where you had to pack a weapon in order to protect yourself. You couldn't walk to the corner store without being shot at or assaulted. What changes for you when you add, now I'm empowered because I have a video game that's simulating me being the one in control, because everything else in my life is outside of my ability to control. And I spend hours in front of this simulation that teaches me that I can be in control of something. Something shifts in your awareness, something shifts in your brain stem, literally. And so we're going to watch a video, and I just want to get your perspective. So if you have to, take some notes. We'll have just a brief conversation about what we see here.